starts. It starts out with Professor James Dyke speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with him. So get ready to raise your hand for that, and feel free to post in the chat and the Q&A function. And then following that, we'll shift over to student activist Adam Cooper and Monica Nelson to talk about the UC policy, and there'll be Q&A about that. So I'm just briefly going to introduce James now. James is Professor, Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, professor over there. He did postdoctoral research on biogeochemistry, and he has faculty level experience with complex sociological modeling. He's written over 100 articles, many of them peer-reviewed, others in the news media such as The Guardian. He's published a book called Firestorm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change, that came out in 2021. And he's a regular contributor to UK BBC radio and TV programs. So James, we're so glad to have you here all the way from Exeter. Please carry on.
Many thanks, Adam, and many thanks for inviting me to speak to you all this evening for me, this afternoon for you. I'm a big fan of the work that's happening over there, and I'm working with a group over here, and we are taking inspiration from some of the work that is happening across the pond, if I may. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about what I said is offsetting, insetting, and science-based can kicking. Sometimes science doesn't help, sometimes academia doesn't help, sometimes academics don't actually help the fight for the climate justice that we also desperately need. And I'm going to take a particular kind of narrated thread through some of this work that I think is going to be directly relevant to the things we're going to be talking about later. Okay, so let's get going. The reason we're here, maybe not the entire reason we're here, but an important reason we're here right now is to talk about the Paris Agreement of 2015. This was the first time the international community agreed to do what was required to avoid dangerous climate change. And dangerous climate change back in 2015 came to be understood to be well below 2 degrees Celsius, with in the last, let's say, 5 years, the emerging consensus that what that really means is 1.5. So this notion of 1.5 to stay alive, that the Paris Agreement's highest aspiration, highest ambition should be really understood at holding the line at 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we don't do that, then we will be exposing significant fractions of humanity to intolerable suffering through climate change. The thing is, we're getting pretty close, right? We all know that we have warmed the climate by at least 1.1, 1.2, maybe 1.3 degrees Celsius since the middle of the 19th century, since pre-industrial periods. Obviously, when you start measuring it, does determine how much we have warmed. I just want to show this particular figure to orientate us, not just how far we've come, but the warming future that we've got is still in our hands. We still have yet to activate tipping elements which are going to drag the Earth into some kind of hothouse state. The amount of warming that we're going to see over the rest of this century and for thousands of years into the future is going to be largely determined by the amount of coal, oil and gas that we burn in this century. Now, this figure is pretty cool because it shows this incredibly simple relationship between cumulative emissions and total amount of warming. So you've got this line here, this kind of a historical global warming line, and it goes from 0 all the way up to about, a little over 1 degree Celsius now. And many people, when they first look at this, think, well, this is time because it's been getting warmer over time, but it's not time. This axis is cumulative CO2 emissions since 1850 as measured in gigatons, billions of tons. So you can see that we're approaching, cumulative emissions of about 2,500 gigatons of CO2, and that cumulative emissions has produced an incredibly linear relationship. It's essentially like a straight line. And what this means is if we continue to emit carbon, then we will continue to increase temperatures, and these different shaded regions are different possible scenarios. They're shared socio-economic pathways. They kind of used to be called representative concentration pathways. They're just different kind of scenarios that can be modeled in various levels of detail that say, well, over the course of this century, we're going to put this much CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere. If we want to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees, then we want to be limiting cumulative emissions to, let's say, below 3,000 billion tons of CO2, SSP 1 or 1.9. The uncertainty that we've got, there is still a stubborn kind of range of uncertainty when it comes to climate sensitivity. But when we're dealing with temperatures which we are so near to, tenths of a degree, it's not that this uncertainty doesn't matter, but we know exactly what we need to do. We need to conserve that available carbon budget. This is what it looks like with regards to how quickly do we need to decarbonize. At the moment, humanity burns about 40 billion tons of CO2 each and every year. And in 2021, if we were going to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we had an available carbon budget of about 420 gigatons of carbon for a 50% chance. So basically it's a flip of a coin, right? We've got about 420 gigatons of carbon that we can put into the air if we want to limit warming with about a 50-50 chance of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the takeaway message from this picture, of course, is it's a precipitous drop. It's almost a near vertical line now. Unfortunately, it gets worse because depending on how you calculate the carbon budget, it will get smaller, but also because emissions are not going down, they're certainly not undertaking a precipitous drop. Every year in which we continue to put carbon into the Earth's atmosphere, that budget gets smaller, therefore the reductions need to happen even faster. So by about the end of 2022, various estimates could put the 1.5 budget as little as 320 gigatons of carbon. If you factor in other things, it could even be smaller, aerosols, sulfur, dimming, other kind of impacts and effects. I'm going to show a slide here that was produced in partnership with Kevin Anderson. This isn't my work, but this is some of the work that Kevin's been doing. And Kevin Anderson has been looking at carbon budgets available, not just for the Paris Agreement 1.5, but for any amount of particular warming for a number of years. And we could look at this as kind of just zooming in on that previous chart. So here we are around the order of about 40 billion tons a year. If we want to limit warming to no more than 1.5, then globally, we need to have zero emissions around 2040, sometime before 2050. Now, this ignores issues of equity. Richer nations need to do this faster. The United States, United Kingdom need to decarbonize faster than the global average because we need to allow developing, emerging nations, still industrializing nations, some development space, some carbon space in order for them to effectively catch up. So this is really just showing us a global amount. And this figure, which is marked out in B here, this arrow, about 2032, is basically if we continue with emissions of 40 billion tons, each and every year, then by around 2032, that budget is gone. Well, as you know, emissions are not coming down. They are responding quite vigorously to increasing economic activity. There is still almost an iron law between economic activity and fossil fuels. We still largely drive economic growth by burning coal, oil, and gas. So all that talk about Build Back Better, remember in the middle of the COVID pandemic, the global pandemic, we were locking down entire economies, and I was involved along with many other people proposing arguments and saying, look, the last thing we want to do is when we recover from this terrible situation is just to power on all the fossil fuel infrastructure, just to open up all the coal plants, also open up all transport, continue to burn petrol and kerosene. We need to use this disruptive moment, this annual reduction of CO2 emissions of 5, 6, maybe even 7%, and somehow use that as a turning point. Well, of course, that didn't happen. It's a great meme, and it's nothing more than a hashtag. We have Built Back Better if you're a fossil fuel company, which are currently making record-breaking profits because as the COVID pandemic has gone, that release, that brake on economic growth has been thrown away. The economies are booming again, even though we might have some issues of impending recessions, and with it, fossil fuels have come back in a big way. Now, the picture gets even worse in some respects, because if you look at what international politics is currently doing in the remit of the Paris Agreement, then we are still failing to take seriously that highest aspiration of the Paris Agreement, or even 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So NDCs, nationally determined contributions, these are part of the Paris framework whereby essentially every nation comes up with its assessment of how rapidly it's going to decarbonize. It's their national contribution. And then we do a stock take of those national contributions, to what extent they are translating into policy, and to what extent will that policy then remove or reduce the total amount of carbon that we would expect to see in the atmosphere. And when you do that, when you're looking at current nationally determined contributions, current NDCs, then we could see that the remaining budget up to and post 2030, well, by the time we get to 2030, in as little as 7 years, there's only 56 gigatons of carbon left for a 50% chance of not exceeding 1.5. So that's within 1.4 years. And the response that you should have at this point is, there's a certain kind of language that I can't use in polite company. The budget is rapidly running out because nation states and industry and arguably wider sections of society are not taking serious what the Paris Agreement means in terms of rapid decarbonisation. But if that's the case, if we still see this increasing gap between NDCs, national ambition, and what reality requires, what the climate system requires, then how do politicians continue to say 1.5 is still alive? How can they continue to say one more heave and we can be on track? Why is there not the wider recognition that climate policy has catastrophically failed or is failing? And the reason is because they can soften the curve, they can soften the blow. Now, if you look at this scenario for 1.5, yes, there is a decrease in positive emissions. This is a brown curve, but you can see we're not getting to actual zero emissions until the end of this century. It's the black line which is going to produce a warming of no more than 1.5, and if you look carefully, that goes under the zero. So these are negative emissions. Basically, it is proposed mainstream policy, pretty much every national policy now, involves the significant removal of carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere using a whole range of schemes, something that's called gross negative emissions. It's very, very complicated. We could spend the next ends of time talking about how the different technologies and science are emerging in which is being proposed how we're going to do that. I'm just going to summarize it by saying, hey, there's other things you should be thinking about right now. Science and technology is going to figure it out. Don't worry, the grown-ups are in control. One way in which it was proposed that we could do this, and I won't linger on this for very long, even though I do appreciate the slide is quite complicated, is through something called bioenergy carbon capture and storage. It's rapidly emerged at the time of the Paris Agreement when it was acknowledged that 1.5 was a real stretch goal. Well below 2 degrees was very, very challenging. There didn't seem to be any intimation that national policies were going to bend the curve quickly. So then we're thinking about what potential routes could we get to remove carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere, and BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, rapidly came to be seen as the most promising carbon savior technology, and essentially works by burning biomass instead of coal in a thermal power plant, generating electricity, then capturing the CO2 that will come out the chimney stack and then burying that underground, sequestering it in kind of a geological storage where it would stay forever. So that generates electricity, but because plants or trees as they grow absorb carbon dioxide, you're also removing CO2 from the Earth's atmosphere. Great, what's not to love? Unfortunately, an awful lot, because we can already see that bioenergy is already increasing deforestation. Drax in the United Kingdom, one of Europe's largest previously coal-fired powered plants, has over the last 10 years switched to biomass and is now one of the drivers of deforestation of old growth forests in North America, where we are chopping down ancient trees, wood chipping them, putting them in containers, shipping them over the Atlantic to be burnt in a power station in order to allow English people to watch telly. And more generally, there's increasing skepticism about the role of trees, maybe even afforestation, reforestation, for a number of reasons that maybe we might be able to pick up in the Q&A. What about high-tech approaches? What about not so much the nature-based solutions, but the new, the chrome, the durable kind of solutions? For example, direct air capture. You may have heard about Climeworks. It makes the news every now and again. They have pilot facilities around the world. The famous one is in Iceland, where they do direct air capture. They suck out carbon dioxide directly from the air, and they store it deep underground in active geological deposits. This pilot system is currently sequestering something in the order of about 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Remember, current emissions are 40 billion tons. And if you do the maths, and many people have, then the possibilities or the probabilities of this scaling up in time for 1.5 are, I would argue, vanishingly small now. We're looking at maybe 25% of global electricity generation being consumed by nothing more than direct air capture systems to reduce concentrations of CO2, and then astronomical costs of hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's not going to be the climate savior tech that we want. At the moment, the clever money is on looking for innovations that's going to improve the chemistries, improve the efficiency of scale, but I do remain very skeptical about our ability to scale up geological sequestration, because every injection site is probably going to be different. It's going to have its own kind of geological challenges that we will have to address. Okay. I have to mention that this is not just an issue that's happening in nation state actors. Commercial interests, corporations, industry are importantly driving carbon removal and the net zero narrative of we can still limit warming to no more than 1.5. I will just single out at random Shell as one of the proponents for the use of technology and science and engineering to limit warming rather than stopping burning oil and gas and coal. So a couple of years ago, Sky published the Shell scenario in which it proposed it would offset or become carbon neutral by 2050 for its scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So even the emissions that it produce that arise from burning the coal, burning its oil and gas. And at the time, it was going to do that by essentially afforestation, by planting trees. As this quote says, offsetting carbon emissions with forest growth at this scale is a dangerous fantasy. It was not particularly well received, and there has been recent research funding here at my home institution, which they are looking at not just trees, but maybe soil. And I think it just continues that potentially dangerous narrative that oil and gas companies can continue to buy social license to remain core oil and gas companies. That, in my opinion, is what they are paying for. That's what they're getting in terms of this research. I shan't linger on here because I think we're all experts on some of the broader issues around offsetting. The idea that you can jump on a plane and then plant a tree and then offset your emissions is fundamentally flawed for a whole number of reasons. And also the voluntary carbon market system itself has got some fundamental problems. There was a wonderful piece of research undertaken by The Guardian and other news media organizations early this year. It's a research that's been going on for a number of years, that it's shown some of the biggest certifiers of carbon credits are certifying credits that just don't exist. The credibility of these voluntary credit carbon schemes is very, very low at the moment, which has prompted the UNFCCC to advocate that we need to go beyond voluntary markets. There now needs to be regulation. I also want to mention at this point science-based targets, because I want to support the science-based target initiative, the idea that corporations, not just nations, not just countries, but corporations, industries need to take responsibility to get to that road to zero by at least 2050. And so the Science-Based Targets Organization has been very influential and been quite successful in getting different organizations signed up. Unfortunately, it has been controversial. There have been a number of high-profile incidents in which organizations have been certified as being on a path to net zero by the science-based targets, and they didn't really have any credible pathway. They didn't have any kind of credible plan in order to how to decarbonize. More generally speaking, whilst science-based targets and the associated consultancy that you could buy with it is useful for many institutions, I don't think science-based targets have got any place for certifying universities. Universities and research institutes are generating the knowledge which science-based targets might be using as their foundation. Universities should have all the skills, all the understanding, capabilities and competencies to be able to do this work themselves. Now, one reason science-based targets and the associated consultancy is kind of exploded is because decarbonizing is not easy, it's not straightforward. It seems to be much more complicated than people initially think. So I just want to very briefly explain scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions here. So scope 1 emissions are the things that we can most easily understand. They're the kind of the direct emissions, the amount of CO2 that might come out of your chimney on your building or in your organization or on your campus which directly is burning, let's say, fossil gas, which is burning methane in order to generate heat, in order to generate power. They're direct emissions, and you reduce those direct emissions by stopping burning fossil fuels. Indirect emissions could be through the sort of the CO2, which is produced by the energy that you consume. So the electricity that's coming through my lights at the moment is not 100% renewable. So it will be involved probably in the UK at this time of day. Will be generated by a gas-fired power station, which is unabated gas that's producing CO2. And then you've got indirect emissions. For example, the transport involved in your staff going to, or your students traveling to your institution, and then upstream and downstream emissions from the products and services you buy and the products and services that you sell. One thing that's emerging, that's very interesting emerging with regards to indirect emissions, is something called carbon offsetting, where this is just I took it at random from My Climate. Insetting refers to the financing of climate protection projects along a company's own value chain that demonstrably reduce or sequester emissions and thereby achieve a positive impact on the community's landscape and ecosystem associated with the value chain. So maybe we won't decrease our scope 1, our direct emissions, but we'll work with our supplier to help them electrify their transport fleet, and therefore we can claim those indirect emissions as an example of carbon offsetting, therefore our entire emissions portfolio is reduced. This is extraordinarily problematic, as you can understand, because who owns the credits, right? Is that my scope 3 emissions reduction, which I can claim, or is it the organization's direct scope 1 emissions reduction or scope 2 emissions reduction that they can claim? The thing that we need to always be bearing in mind is that we need to keep these separate. You put these together, you're going to come up with a much more complicated portfolio of responses, because the continual risk is that it will avert your gaze from the thing that we need to maintain a laser-like focus. We need to undertake a laser-like focus to reduce emissions. We have to stop burning coal, oil and gas. That's the only thing that matters. The climate doesn't care about where we account for the emissions reduction, doesn't care about if we call it scope 1, 2 or 3. If somewhere in our industrial activities we're not reducing CO2 emissions, we're not reducing the burning of fossil fuels, then it's kind of pointless. So to summarize, I would say my talk is that Superman wants you to stop burning fossil fuels. The rest, it's kind of details. And I'm not saying it's not difficult, I'm not saying it's not challenging, but we can't lose sight of this very fundamental message. Just recently, yesterday actually, the IPCC synthesis report was released that made just clear once again how perilously close we are to 1.5, and that every fraction of a degree above 1.5 matters. The amount of fossil fuels we burn will increase the amount of warming, which will increase the amount of suffering and destruction and death. It's not necessarily smooth, but there's a straight relationship between burning fossil fuels and destruction and death. So the thing we need to do is stop burning fossil fuels. And why us? Why the United States? I'm going to leave you with this little video. What this shows is cumulative emissions since the middle of the 19th century with regards to the remaining budget for 1.5 here. And this is CO2, not just from fossil fuels, but from land use and forestry. So deforestation and converting ecosystems into agriculture mainly, which is why you see countries such as Russia and Indonesia being surprisingly perhaps prominent in the 19th and early 20th century. But look, the headline, it's the United States. The United States is the world's leading industrial power. It has been for a couple of centuries. It's also undertaken large-scale change in its land surface. And so it's no surprise that for the cumulative impact the United States has, it is still far, far ahead. And what about China? Yes, China is catching up. The last 20 years has seen a spectacular increase in the activity of China. Remember, because they are significantly making goods and services for us. Yes, their domestic market is increasing, but we have significantly outsourced our emissions to those. Richer nations, industrialized nations that got here first, have the preponderant responsibility to decarbonize first and allow others to undertake rapid acceleration through hopefully avoiding some of the fossil fuel mistakes that we made. And I think I might be out of time and we should then move on to questions, but many thanks for attention. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James, for a very clear-eyed view of where we find ourselves and some of the solutions or non-solutions that are circulating in this space. And and that I think we all should be very aware of. We have time for one or two quick questions. I think Kristen has one in the chat. I'll read it for you. What are your thoughts of giving household subsidies to switch to greener energy? For instance, getting solar panels and switching to all electric appliances. A lot of people who care to do this can't reasonably afford it.
There is an important place for incentives and grants and schemes. In the United Kingdom at the moment, there are efforts to just insulate people's homes. The thermal performance of many residential buildings in the United Kingdom are appalling. It's a bit of a joke. When my European colleagues, they laugh at just how cold British houses are. The reason they're so cold is because we had such abundant natural gas, fossil gas. So you don't need to insulate your home, you just turn the fire up. When we want to install a heat pump, they're really expensive. So there's an important role for the public sector, for governments to incentivize the private sector through grants to scale up production of heat pumps, of insulation, for solar thermal, for PV. All of these things can be significantly accelerated with a modest amount of public funding through, let's say, the taxpayer, right? We can't expect every individual and every individual household to shoulder the burden for their complete decarbonisation.
Great. And there's another question that just popped up in the chat. What do you think the top priorities for California to be investing in to get the best carbon reduction bang for our tax buck?
Well, I mean, I don't know. But if it doesn't involve the rapid reduction in coal, oil and gas, then it's fiddling whilst the planet burns, I would say. So, for example, if you have a university campus which is burning significant amounts of fossil gas, right? Maybe stop doing that. Maybe think about, yes, it's not going to be cheap, but you need to stop doing that. You need to transition to alternative ways of heat and of electricity generation.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that the IPCC has a wonderful graphic that really ranks by cost, cheapest to most expensive, and all offshore wind, solar are by far and away generally the most cost-effective, most cost-saving ways going forward. All right, we're going to move on with the second part of the presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Monica Nelson, who has long been very active in this space and leading UC Green New Deal in advocating for a more sustainable and just environment, and has been very active in holding and compelling UC to live up to its own better self. Monica, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Mark. And welcome all to this second part of this webinar. I'm a steering committee member on the UC Green New Deal Coalition and a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography down at UC San Diego. And, we're trying to channel all of that urgency that we just heard from James Dyke into creating a vision for a fossil-free UC. Our university is saying it's a leader in climate science, saying it's a leader in climate action, but the new goals that it's recently put out in the new draft climate protection plan really don't embody the urgency that I imagine many of you are sort of sitting with after hearing James speak. So, as James mentioned, we've just had this recent synthesis report come out, and there are some pretty damning statements in that. There is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all, and the choices and actions implemented this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. So this is the moment to act. This is our time. I mean, arguably we should have been acting years ago, but here we are, and we need to desperately push in this moment for that dramatic decrease in emissions. So we've had this, this is the Keeling curve. This is the monitoring of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that has been going on for 60 years. And as James mentioned, we've had this, steady rise in atmospheric CO2, and that is very linearly correlated with the amount of temperature rise we're experiencing on Earth. We are here in this moment of urgency because we did not start our climate action when these emissions started to go up. The UC didn't create a climate action sort of policy or goal or statement until 2013, way up here after emissions had been rising and rising and rising for 50 years. And now we're at 2023, and we are still finding that despite the climate action policy that we've had, global emissions certainly haven't gone down. Local emissions, UC emissions also haven't really gone down. So the past goals that the UC had, the Carbon Neutrality Initiative that was established in 2013, had this overarching goal and focus on being carbon neutral by 2025. So in 2025, there was going to be net zero emissions, which means we buy a bunch of offsets in order to negate the emissions that we are actually producing, and therefore we achieve net zero. James has elucidated many issues with that, but there has been some successes with this CNI, and those are around improving energy efficiency. The UC campuses have grown a lot over the past 10 years since this initiative has been in place. And while emissions haven't gone down, they have managed to flatline with that campus growth. Initially, we now purchase 100% clean. We purchase clean electricity, which is, that comes into the scope 2 emissions. And there is a bit of a caveat here where, we can pay our local utilities to provide us with clean electricity. It's not actually possible in the current energy grid to always have clean electricity because we don't have the battery storage that we need for intermittent renewables. So a bit of a caveat on that point. And there has also been, out of the CNI, extra support for student, faculty, and staff climate research and education. However, we have not meaningfully reduced our scope 1 or our scope 3 emissions. This is a plan that did not prioritize the on-campus development of renewables. Instead, we're outsourcing that to the local utilities. And additionally, as I sort of mentioned at the start of this slide, we've really prioritized using carbon offsets for 10 years, which have delayed actually taking responsibility for the emissions that we emit here on our campuses. And I think lastly, there's been kind of a disconnect between UC climate scientists and activists, which is also evident now in this new climate protection policy, which states that their goals are in line with keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but the goal isn't to be isn't to reduce emissions to near zero until 2045, which is just way too late. So zooming in now on what those emissions actually look like, so you don't just have to take my word for it. These are the historic UC emissions, so aggregated across the 10 campuses. So red is scope 1, and you can see that over the past decade, scope 1 emissions, the emissions that come from burning methane gas on our campuses, that's just been steady across the past decade. Scope 2 emissions, which come from the electricity and energy that we purchase and bring into our campus, has gone down. This blue wedge has reduced, and that's because we are now buying this renewable energy instead of just the regular grid mix. And then finally, our scope 3 emissions, which are largely associated in the UC accounting with business-related travel, took a notable drop in 2019 due to the pandemic, and everybody wasn't traveling, people weren't driving to campus. So that took a measurable drop, and what we really need to do now is make sure that that doesn't billow up again to this pre-pandemic value. In response to that, lack of action, lack of actual reduction of campus emissions, various people around the University of California have been increasingly frustrated and formed the UC Green New Deal Coalition in 2020 to push for more meaningful climate action across our system and from our leadership. And to that end, there was a Electrify UC petition in 2020 that was calling for the electrification of our methane burning power plants on campus, which garnered signatures of 3,500 individuals, as well as being endorsed by UC unions, which represented nearly 50,000 people, as well as the associated students and the UC Graduate and Professional Council, which is the representative bodies of our undergrad and graduate populations. And on Earth Day this past year, we had 9 simultaneous rallies across 9 of the campuses, really, again, emphasizing this demand for electrification of our campus energy system. So we sent a really strong message to the UCOP that more climate action was necessary, more climate action was really wanted by their community members. And this was then hand in hand with the Academic Senate Faculty Memorial in 2022. So the Senate faculty wrote this statement, official statement that says, the UC of California Academic Senate petitions the Regents for investments in UC's infrastructure that will reduce on-campus fossil fuel combustion by at least 60% of current levels by 2030 and 95% of current levels by 2035. So really clear statements of goals for climate action for the UC. And the sort of combination of these various different parts of the UC community demanding more action from leadership led to the formation of the Pathways to a Fossil-Free UC Task Force by our UCOP Sustainability Steering Committee. And they will oversee the $13 million of electrification planning funding, which is part of this ongoing effort to create real change on our campus. And so with that, I'm now going to hand over to Adam Cooper to take you through these proposed policy updates for the current plan.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Cooper. I'm a PhD candidate in atmospheric chemistry at UC San Diego, and I serve as our energy systems lead with our on-campus UCSD Green New Deal. Monica did a really good job going through the history of how we got to this moment in time. And so here we are in 2023. We have $13 million to develop plans to rapidly decarbonize all of our campuses. And we're in the process of revising policy at the UC-wide level in order to guide how fast those plans will actually be implemented. And unfortunately, what's being proposed right now is too little and too late. Fundamentally, this policy update abandons carbon neutrality by 2025 for scopes 1 and 2 in favor of net zero by 2045 in favors of scopes 1, 2, and 3. The main difference between carbon neutrality being unlimited use of offsets and net zero being limited use of offsets for the last 10% by their own definitions. In this policy, there's interim campus minimum reductions by just 30% compared to the 2009 baseline, with a stretch goal of 55%, and that's per campus. And although these minimums are rather low, they expect, through some type of faith, that the system-wide aggregate goal of a 50% reduction from that baseline will be met. Using that 2009 baseline incorporates the successes from the last 14 years into these climate goals, making it so that it won't be as much of a reduction as it seems at first, as if we were using a more recent baseline. And the policy also continues the use of biogas. So paying someone in Louisiana to produce methane from biological sources while continuing to use fossil gas on campus, and also introduce the use of hydrogen, which has its own associated problems we'll be going into in the next couple of slides. You can go to the next slide. So here's where UC will be taking us if this climate protection policy is passed, and if we can meet the interim goals that they set in it. By 2025, it's already university policy that will purchase enough of those renewable energy certificates to count our scope 2 emissions as zero. That'll achieve about a 20% reduction alone from that 2009 baseline. And so there's a 30% reduction to be shared between the scopes 1 and 3, which we project to be a slight rebound of scope 3 emissions from the COVID-19 lockdowns and a slight decrease in the scope 1 emissions from real progress towards decarbonization. There's a mystery 2035 goal that campuses will set at some future point. And by 2045, we're projected to go down to a 90% reduction from that 2009 baseline, still allowing the emissions of 175,000 tons of CO2, which is roughly in between what UC Irvine and UC Berkeley emit today. So still a campus's worth of carbon emissions being emitted, even in 2045, 22 years from now. Go to the next slide. There's a lot of concerns and climate loopholes that reduce even the efficacy that was shown in that last graph. The first one is strategic. If you tell each campus they need to reduce by a minimum of 30%, and then hope that you'll get a 50% system-wide aggregate reduction, we just don't think that's likely to happen with the politics in the UC system. Those 175,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year that will need to be removed by 2045 is really expensive. Using the industry target of $100 per ton for permanent carbon removal, that's $18 million per year to remove those emissions. Using current prices of things like direct air capture, that's $350 million per year, a really expensive price to pay when it's a lot cheaper and easier to just replace that with renewables and battery storage. It also allows the unlimited use of a couple of different offsetting techniques in order to underreport our actual emissions that are coming from our campuses. This includes the unlimited use of these renewable energy credits, paying someone else to produce renewable electricity, probably at some other point of time, while using the industry grid electricity instead of managing our energy systems ourselves. Using these biomethane certificates, biomethane making up only 0.2% of current methane feedstock, and having all of the associated risks and damages from methane included in there. Methane leaks, and when it leaks, it's a greenhouse gas 86 times as potent as CO2 over the near time horizon over 20 years. As well as using certificates for the production of green hydrogen, which is currently only 1% of hydrogen. That's when you produce hydrogen using renewable electricity to split water. But that's a very energy intensive process. It takes 3 times as much electricity to produce a unit of hydrogen that you can get out of it. Hydrogen is basically a battery. It's not an energy source. It also leaks, and it acts as a secondary greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, making it 33 times as potent as CO2 per unit of emission over a 20-year time horizon. And so we've been discussing this inside the UC Green New Deal Coalition and coming up with ways that we can tweak this policy while still being realistic to university budgets, but acting with the urgency of the climate crisis and acting with our knowledge of carbon budgets. And so we would like to, one, unbundle the scopes instead of having an overall goal, separate them into scopes 1, 2, and 3, and use a near-term baseline of a 2019 level. With this, we're proposing, in line with the faculty memorial, which was passed, a scope 1 emissions reduction target of 2035 with a 60% reduction short-term goal by 2030. We suggest putting the policy that scope 2 emissions will reduce to 0 front and center in our climate goals, and have a scope 2 reductions to 0 goal by 2025. And with a scope 3 emissions reduction goal of 2040, once again with a 60% reduction by 2030. We're actually already at that 60% reduction from the COVID-19 lockdown. And so to achieve that interim goal, we'll just have to maintain the current mode shift for climate, promoting work from home, promoting public transit, not having everyone come into work every single day physically, in order to reduce our carbon footprint in that way. And we also are abandoning the net zero, the carbon neutrality language to avoid all of the carbon accounting, and just saying, let's focus on pure emissions reductions, because that's what's going to get us out of the climate crisis, not these accounting tricks. Go to the next slide. We can kind of show graphically what this looks like. And so it's a much more rapid decrease, getting to residual levels by 2035 as we take the most ownership over our greatest source of emissions, scope 1 emissions, going down to residual levels through 2040 and projected from onwards from there. You go to the next slide. And along with this policy, we'd like to close the loopholes. Currently, there's no policy being proposed that actually requires the campuses to follow electrification plans paid for by California taxpayers upon their completion. We would like those campuses to actually use those plans and to make those plans knowing that they will be used and knowing that they will be used to achieve that timeline by 2035. We'd like to reduce allowable residual emissions to less than 5% per scope and continue to focus on reducing those emissions over carbon removal to minimize that net zero accounting trap. We'd like to prioritize UC on campus and contracted renewables over these renewable energy credits. And we'd like to stop relying on dirty, expensive, and potentially dangerous technologies. There's simply no path towards a fossil-free UC where we heavily rely on the combustion of fossil gas, methane gas, and hydrogen gas. We need to move away from a combustion-based methane energy supply, treat biogas as an offset, not like a ticket to keep on burning fossil gas, and save it for things like backup generators, backup cogeneration plants even, in times of emergencies and other residual emissions, while we maintain our day-to-day energy systems using renewables and storage. And we can't rely on the green hydrogen hype to allow us to keep on using combustion-based systems. Hydrogen is expensive, it's explosive, it's leaky, and we can't pretend like it's the magic bullet that's going to save us from the climate crisis. There are uses for it. It's a useful battery for storing excess renewable energy during the day. And there are proper end uses for it, such as at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, converting a lot of its ships to hydrogen. On to the next slide. And taking these steps comes with a lot of tangible benefits. By taking those shortcuts, not relying on fossil fuel industry tactics to extend the lifetime of fossil fuels, it'll truly make the University of California a global leader and a global model in how to decarbonize equitably. And once we begin walking the walk, for all of our talking the talk on climate education and climate research, we'll really incorporate climate justice more fully into our institution. And just these proposed changes alone, from the UC path to our proposed fossil-free path, will save an accumulation of 7 million tons of CO2 from now, 2021, to 2045. How fast we reduce CO2 really matters because it accumulates for thousands of years in the atmosphere. And this saving, using the social cost of carbon, will avoid about $1.7 billion in climate-related damages, and it'll save 1,600 lives from extreme heat risks alone. And next slide, I think, is the final slide. Fundamentally, we're at an impasse right now. Which path will the UC choose? Will we rapidly go towards a fossil-free future within this decade? Or will we continue slowly along, doing what's easy, doing what the fossil fuel companies are doing, relying on these science-based target initiatives, and continue burning a lot of methane gas on our campuses for the foreseeable future? You have a critical role in determining which path the UC will choose through this feedback period. And I'll pass it back to Monica to kind of handle the Q&A and also introduce some of the ways that you can provide feedback right now.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I was jumping. I meant to head to this slide. And just as we have the Q&A going now, just going to put up these couple of QR codes, which one take you directly, the one on the left here takes you directly to the feedback form that the task force has put out soliciting feedback on their policy, and the QR code here on the right takes you to some sort of brief talking points that we have put together to for folks to use as inspiration for their own feedback. So we'll leave those there for now and transition to some Q&A.
Monica, if you want, since you were one of the main presenters, I can read out the Q&As or the Qs, and then you and Adam and James could weigh in. What do you think of that?
Perfect.
Okay, great, because I accidentally moved one and I feel bad about that. Okay, so somebody wrote, it's under answered, why should UC be a leader in emissions reductions? What does that really mean for the state, for the nation, in terms of higher education institutions and or the corporate world? Can you talk about some of the implications for aggressive reduction goals if set by the UC? And I think that could be a question for anybody.
Yeah, sure. I can take a stab and hand over to others if they want to add anything. I mean, for one, like the UC is huge, and so it actually like is a really sizable contributor to state emissions. And I mean, the UC itself totes itself as a leader in climate action. So they're saying they want to fill this role. They're huge, so if they do fill the role, it will actually be meaningful, and we can also provide a model for transitions from other like big institutions or corporate industry to follow. So I think those are my main reasons as to why the UC should do this. I'll stop there.
And I just discovered Mark wrote something in the Q&A about this. Do you want to weigh in there, Mark Reesing?
Sure. I mean, I'll just quickly add, look, we do two things. Like, we are really good in our science, and we're teaching, and our medical schools are treating and curing people. They're stewards of people's health, and we cannot, in good conscience, serve the really important role of being the social engine of upward mobility for folks who come to us who graduate in a much better place and have much more opportunities in life after they come to us, and then have them graduate in a society that is going to be breaking 1.5 degrees Celsius and all the consequences that follow from that. I mean, there's a moral imperative there. And it's, for all the talk of equity and inclusion, well, this is time to actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk. It is investments we have to place and make anyway, just to keep campuses running. Let's make these investments the right ones. And let's make these investments so we can draw down the sizable emissions that we continue to emit and have been flatlined on our campuses for the last decade plus.
Great. This is a question from Kathy, and this was back in the James section and it got overlooked. I think it appeared in the chat. She asks, why do you think climate scientists don't always support rapid drawdown?
I'm not, okay, well, some will, depending on how you define drawdown. There's been quite a bit of evangelism around the opportunities and capabilities for us to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You're going to get a lot of grants, you're going to get a lot of papers, you're going to do that. And sometimes, I mean, I don't know if anyone's already mentioned the moral hazard of geoengineering and future proposed carbon removal. You know, if you offer future solutions, you are essentially enabling policymakers, administrators, business leaders, the opportunity to produce an argument that says, don't worry, we don't have to decarbonize too fast, right? We're going to fix it, you know, in 10 years time or in 20 years time. We need time to get the technologies to mature. You're kind of providing them an opportunity for them to not make what they consider to be difficult decisions, which is, you know, turn off the coal, oil and gas infrastructure. So sometimes you might find potentially powerful champions in academia who want to not push back against what is sometimes given as a very rosy picture, as a very optimistic picture of, you know, through innovation and development and growth, we're going to fix the problem. If you interpret it more broadly, i.e. not just removal, but also mitigation, then I think you're up to issues of power. You know, one of the reasons why decarbonisation is so hard is not because it's physics, it's because it's money and it's politics. And academics, many academics, and in particular my experience, many senior academics do not want to cross that line that separates academia to wider concerns, let alone politics or even party politics.
Okay, so this is maybe a related question. An anonymous asks, can you clarify, and I think this might be mostly to the first part of it to James, the second part to Monica and Adam. Can you clarify why 10 years matters in terms of global temperature increases and climate catastrophe if 2035 is set as the true zero date for UC instead of 2045? Aside from setting policy, what does each UC campus have to do to electrify?
Okay, so maybe I'll do the first bit. There's more media reporting and reportage about tipping points or tipping elements. There's one reason is because there's increasing science that seems to be showing us that tipping elements may be activated at lower temperatures, maybe even above 1 degree Celsius. So we could have already initiated irreversible changes in the Greenland ice sheet and the Western Antarctic ice sheet, but those things are probably going to take a very, very long time to unfold. But other tipping elements, other tipping points might happen, overturning ocean circulation, Amazon dieback. But I still think that that picture I showed right at the start, that relatively straight line, that linear relationship between cumulative emissions and warming, we're not going to hit a cliff. It's not as if beyond 1.5 suddenly the Earth is going to be ejected into a hothouse Earth. What we're going to do is we're going to increase the probability of more intense and destructive weather, or increase more destruction, death and suffering, and we're going to make it much, much harder to decarbonize and keep people safe, to mitigate, to adapt, maybe to geoengineer, to do carbon removal. Everything just gets harder. 1.5 emerged at the Paris Agreement in 2015 because it was recognized back then that small island developing nation states would literally be underwater above 1.5 degrees Celsius. They would not exist. And many of the most vulnerable people to climate change would undergo intolerable suffering above 1.5. So the Paris Agreement was an absolute success. It was a very, very surprising success that acknowledged that there are vast disparities in exposure and vulnerability to climate change. What should have happened in 2015 is that the rich industrialized nations, the ones who have profited most from fossil fuels, should have enacted immediate reductions in the burning of coal, oil and gas to take their responsibility seriously. They didn't do that. What they did, they invoked a whole constellation of net zero policies, which basically said, don't worry, growth can continue, innovation can continue, and we'll kind of figure out how to remove tens of billions of tons of CO2 from the carbon sometime around the middle of this century and essentially forever. It was a missed opportunity. The 2050 target is becoming closer and closer as we're using up the rest of the available budget for 1.5. And if you want to take equity seriously, that means the richer nations need to decarbonize even faster. So you end up with a situation where the United States or the United Kingdom needs to decarbonize by the middle of the 2030s or something. So that's where that kind of date gets from. But there's no cliff edge as such. The more that we continue to burn fossil fuels, the harder that we will make people's lives and the more lives that we will end.
Thanks, James. I also want to acknowledge we're past 1 o'clock now. We'll likely keep on continuing discussion, but if you need to go, feel free to do so. And thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to respond to the second part of the question, which is how do these campuses electrify? And we know how to do it because other universities have already done it. Stanford University started in 2015 and last year in 2022 completed its transition from having an energy system based on an on-campus cogeneration methane plant, which 7 out of 10 of our campuses do, to having a fully electrified heating and cooling system that's through industrial sized heat pumps, as well as fully renewable energy procurement, which they did through an off-campus, 2 off-campus solar farms, which isn't the best possibility, but is one way to do it. And so what we like to do is kind of follow that model with replacing heating and cooling from a methane-based system to these electric heat pumps and prioritizing more local and on-campus renewable energy, but also other off-campus contracts in order to meet the raise in electricity demand that those heating and cooling systems will do. So it is possible. They did it in 7 years. We're asking UC to do it in 12. And I think that's the best path forward.
Okay, I'm going to fold a couple of questions in together. And I want to also remind everybody that you can go to the answered. Some people are already answering questions in the Q&A. So there's an answered column. So one person asks, how do we get key decision makers, the UC president, chancellors, et cetera, to pay attention and agree to implement these proposed climate policies? And then building on that, somebody asks or mentions that administrative leadership is responsible for the financial stewardship of the university, and respond if there are budgetary analyses to show fiscal feasibility. Return on investment may be positive in the long term for this transition. And Mark might have had something to say about that. But anyway, so the bigger question is, how do we get people to pay attention, particularly top leadership? And what about showing the return on investment?
I can speak to, how do we get the decision makers to pay attention? This is a really critical moment. This policy is in its, it's a draft policy right now. It's new. It is going for approval by the Sustainability Steering Committee on May 5th. But up until April 7th, we can provide feedback on that. And if we are loud and numerous in our feedback, there will be, a very strong message sent to leadership that goals need to be changed and need to be followed through on. We send a strong message that people care, that people are paying attention, that people are watching, and that people will be holding them accountable to, once they commit to these goals, to actually enacting and investing in infrastructure to make sure we can reduce these emissions. We also, other avenues that we as a coalition pursue is showing up and giving public comment at regents meetings, making sure regents, who are the overseeing body for our whole system, are hearing this message as well, are aware of what is actually going on in the climate space, climate policy space in our system, so that they can ask questions. And yeah, just to signal to you that administrators are listening and paying attention to feedback. The feedback was supposed to be closing for the policy March 31st, but there was a bit of an outcry about the fact that coincided with spring break for many campuses, with finals for many campuses, and that it was not, providing opportunities for lots of the community to give feedback. And so the deadline has been extended a week. So people are paying attention, and I really encourage everybody here to pursue that. In terms of return on investment, some of that is coming down to, that's what these decarbonization studies are for, establishing what are the costs to do this? How does that fit with our budgetary timeline? And so the push to get the planning done was a really important first step to convincing the leadership that it's possible. And so we are going, that is a process that is starting now of getting these plans done. And through that, we'll understand the budgetary situation much more clearly.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, there's never been a greater opportunity for federal and state investments in clean energy than there is right now. UC Berkeley was able to procure $200 million for their clean energy project. They're already doing this process of retiring the cogeneration plant in favor of renewables and electric heat pumps. There's a massive amount of money through the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal measures. And the UC's budget itself does have room for these important transitions if it prioritizes it. We're asking for this transition within the next 12 years. By that point, $500 billion will go through the UC. If the current budget at $44 billion a year is held flat, it'll likely go up. And so while this is technically challenging large capital investment structures, the UC is no stranger to doing those when it comes to expanding campuses, making new colleges, making new institutes. We're asking for a similar level of investment in reducing our carbon footprint and fully fulfilling a climate mission.
Someone asks if anyone has any idea how much it costs Stanford to electrify and what would it cost the UC system. So I'll just get that a little tiny bit started. Obviously there's 10 campuses. 3 of them are now completing or have already completed decarbonization studies. The new policy will require decarbonization, and they're using that word for the first time, which is great. Decarbonization plans by by January 1st, 2025. Oh, 485 million. Brilliant, Kathy. So it's in the bottom line is it's in the multiple hundreds of millions of dollars per campus. And bigger campuses would be proportionately more. Does anyone else have any? But we won't know those exact amounts. So Davis, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz now have a figure for that transition. The other campuses would have to complete these decarbonization studies, which they had not previously been required to do. So those figures should be coming. But obviously, until we get the plans, all these fine details are still being worked out. Anyone else want to weigh in there?
I can add a little bit later. So Davis is currently replacing its steam-based for warm water-based district heating system. And when they did the numbers, over the lifetime of the system, it was actually the cheapest option to do what they're doing now. So it's both switching to a system that emits less emissions, can be electrified, and was the cheapest to build. And we're talking about hundreds of millions to like $1 billion plus per campus, but also over the life of 10, 15 years. And you need to compare that to the cost of maintaining energy infrastructure as is, which also is going to cost probably as much or more. So while these numbers are not insignificant, as Adam was saying, this is what UC does. They work with massive budgets for building replacements. Compared to all of that, UC totally can find the funding. And some campuses are actively finding funding, hiring grant writers to go after the increasing pots of money that are available, becoming available federally, exactly to help campuses do what we need to achieve. So, so there is a momentum, and the campuses that position themselves well will be able to hopefully ride that momentum and achieve what we need to do.
Okay, does anyone want to raise a hand? And I can't see the whole gallery because we've got a slide being shown, but if somebody wants to raise their hand, I'm happy to call on people. And anybody can unmute and ask a question. And I hope I haven't overlooked any questions. Okay, so, okay, here we are. Yep, okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Let me turn it back over to Adam.
I can jump in. Yeah, so I guess, that wraps us up for the day. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been really great for us to have so many people here to discuss this with, to share our perspective with. And a reminder, the deadline for feedback is April 7th. Please, please, please go and submit feedback. We know that the feedback is being read and actively considered. And as a final note, Adam alluded to this in the chat, but our UC Green New Deal Coalition does have our monthly town hall this evening at 7 till 8 p.m. We warmly welcome anybody in the community to come and join us at that. Tonight we'll be refining, we'll be sort of continuing some of this discussion around the current policy and talking about how we can turn out, more people to give feedback, how we can refine our language to be best suited to, creating meaningful change. So I think Adam can maybe drop the invitation, the Zoom link information back into the chat one last time for folks, and you can copy and paste that for use this evening. And with that, we will wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thank you all for coming.
And a final thanks, James, for your contributions today. It was really important and valuable to us to have you here.
Well, many thanks for inviting me, and good luck and keep pushing. Many thanks.